Let us classify all regular comics readers, even some semi-regular comics readers, into three broad categories, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I moved from one group to the other. In group one, we have people who have never heard of the Incal, or the Inkle, or the Incal, however it may be heard of, you have not heard of it. This might mean that this video is the first time you're hearing it mentioned, or my previous video, my honorable mentions for my top 10 sci-fi comics of all time, which I'll link in the description below and in the top right corner of your screen. And if that's the case, if I am the person to introduce you to this classic comic by Jodorowsky and Moebius, then I'm honored. But in all honesty, it's sort of like tasting ice cream. It would have happened sooner or later. Sooner or later, you would have heard of the Incal. But given the reputation and following that this comic has, it's probably more likely that you're a member of one of the other two groups. So group two is made up of people who have heard of the Incal, who may even have a passing familiarity with it, but have not read it. You may have seen pages and samples online. You may have seen it discussed and reviewed. You may have seen it as a part of best of and top 10 and top 100 lists, not just of the best sci-fi comics of all time, but of all comics of all time. You may know about its roots as a failed Dune movie by writer Jodorowsky, and you may be familiar with the artwork and the reputation of artist Jean Giraud, or Moebius, which is his pen name or brush name. You may even know for sure how this is pronounced. Is it Incal, Ingle, Incal? I've heard it so many ways, but Wikipedia says it's Inkle, like in bottle, which doesn't quite make sense to me. Of course, it's a made-up word, so there isn't really a reference. But so often the correct pronunciation has been provided by the community of commenters on this channel. I now know how to pronounce Hergé, Bill Sienkiewicz, Tove Jansson, and many more. So if you know how it's pronounced for sure, please leave that in the comments below. But getting back to group two, you may know all these things, but you have still not read this book, not from cover to cover. Your opinion may be informed by a lot of things that other people have said or written, some positive, some negative, but you have yet to get to the book itself. And group three would be all of those people who have read the Incal, many of them more than once. You can range from being a one-time reader who's forgotten most of it to someone who has everything memorized. You definitely have an opinion of it, and perhaps that opinion is unlike any other opinion you have of any other comic. I first encountered the Incal when I was 18 in college. A friend of mine who was into European comics had issues of Metal Hurlant, the seminal famous French anthology comic in which the Incal was serialized. And today I can't help but think what collector's items those issues must be. And at the time when I read it, I found it odd and wonderful, but I wasn't completely sold on it. It was just too strange and different from the superhero comics and funny comics that I was used to reading at that time. So it was in the back of my mind when many years later I started reading comics again, seriously, as an adult. And I kept running into praise and glowing criticism and even religious fervor about this book. But I found it extremely hard to get my hands on it. It was out of print, and what copies you could find were very expensive, so I kept waiting, and Humanoids finally reprinted it in English. It went out of stock, they reprinted it again, and I was finally able to grab myself a copy, read the whole thing, and move into group three. On my first read, I found it astonishing. In spite of how famously ripped off or influential this comic is, how many movies and games and science fiction illustrations are based on things that you can see in this book, in spite of all of that, I found it to be a completely fresh and vibrant read, very different from other sci-fi space sagas that I had read. It was truly like nothing I had seen before. I would stop and pore over things and turn back, and it took me a long time to get through the book because I kept going back and forth rereading parts of it. Still, in spite of how impressive I found it, I wasn't completely blown away. Now, regular viewers of this channel will know that I have no problem being effusive with my praise. So the fact that I couldn't quite say this is one of the greatest things I've ever read means that something hadn't clicked for me. There were just certain things in it that were significant enough to keep it from being one of the greatest comics I've ever read. Now, don't get me wrong, as I mentioned in my previous video, I still put this in the upper echelons of comic storytelling. In spite of my reservations, I am very impressed by its towering achievements. But when the Incal won a poll on the community page here on YouTube, By the way, if you're not aware, we have regular updates and polls and little discussions on the community page here on YouTube. So make sure you check that out. There's a poll going on right now. But when this won the poll for which of my honorable mentions viewers would like to take a closer look at, I thought this would be a perfect opportunity for me to revisit this book and see if my opinions of it have changed. Will I like it less? Will I like it more? Have I as a person changed enough for the story to affect me differently? Am I more sophisticated? Am I less patient? All of these things do affect returning to books, and especially with one in which I had such a mixed reaction to, where I loved part of it but didn't quite love other parts of it, I thought this was a perfect opportunity to give it another shot. And in order to give myself the biggest advantage, to give this book the fairest shot it could have, I thought I should revisit it in the oversized deluxe edition, boasting the original European album size, in hardcover, in a slipcase, with the original colors. Since this is technically a shrunken down version of the original, would the larger size, the handsome production, would this make a difference in my reading? That's what I wanted to find out. So let me tell you how that went. And while I do that, let's take a closer look at this edition. The oversized or original sized edition comes in a slipcase, and it's an unusual slipcase. This is the back with an image of John DeFool, the protagonist of the story, and his animal companion Depot. You can tell it's the back because of the barcode information. The thick spine has another illustration of John with a gun. And the front of the slipcase is actually a minor spoiler because it's a full-page splash from much later in the story. It's an iconic and astonishing one, so there's no wonder they chose it for the cover. The side of the slipcase actually pulls away in a separate section, leaving the book still fully recessed in the rest of the slipcase, which is slightly indented, sort of like an old Nintendo cartridge. The book slips out backwards with its spine facing outside, and the actual cover is a full-page replication. The spine is simple yet striking, and the back cover has a panel detail. This edition comes with a nice long bookmark, although that's not really a difference because the other edition does too. It may be a small thing, but I really love this two-section design for the slipcase, making it a complete and full box, really. Straight from the cover, we can see it's a significant upgrade in size, not inconsiderable, and you can soon make a direct comparison between this plate and this cover. Now, this edition does boast the original colors, although they were also the ones used in the previous edition, not the highly recolored and more drastic ones that a lot of people hate. But the creaminess of the paper, less glossy than the one used in the Humanoids edition, giving it a softer look. The way the story begins, in particular this splash page of John being thrown off and plummeting through the city, which is vertical, all of this is a very gripping, thrown into the middle of the action beginning to the story. It was always that way even in the previous edition. As to be expected, the large size pages really show off the art and the detail that crams almost every panel that Moebius draws. But what I'm also really pleased to see is that the enlargement works really well with the text. This comic, like some other European comics I've seen, does have that style where you've got large word balloons or word boxes with the words centered and sort of isolated with a lot of space around them in the box. This has a really cool effect in the way it sounds to a reader, but I think in the previous edition, for me, this made it slightly hard to read. Reading this is very easy. There's also the feeling, maybe from American comics, that things compressed into that much space are like whispers. So that also may have interfered with my first reading, where it took me some time to think that they're not all whispering, but at this enlarged size, it just feels like speech and narration and makes a really big difference. This is one of the biggest and most pleasant changes for me, the ability for me to read everything very easily as a bonus to the expected art upgrade. So this is definitely an improved reading experience already because of the production and the size. And as I made my way through the story, I found myself as enthralled as I was the first time by being thrown right into the middle of things. The spectacular amount of detail and world building thrown into just a few panels immediately. Some flying around, shooting and explosions to get things started in a way that's not at all representative of the rest of the story. And the little flashback to the police that I hadn't really enjoyed the first time, this time was a little more palatable palatable, knowing that this wasn't just throwaway stuff and knowing that it comes back later in the story in interesting ways. It's over here that I had originally had my first problems with the narration of who's telling the story and which tone we're supposed to have, which does shift and bounce around a lot. And while I wouldn't say this time it didn't bother me, I did find myself a little more forgiving. The random sex and violence doesn't bother me except for when it interferes with me trying to establish a tone. But there's always so much to look at and so much to take in these early pages especially, and so much information being given to you that you're trying to put together, that I think just says you've got to give up one thing to have the other. Now, this is where one of the criticisms of this story that I've read doesn't quite gel with me. People say the art is fantastic, but the story is not so good. Now, the problem with that is in comics, I think of the story as being anything that does the storytelling. I mean, if you're familiar with people who are good storytellers, they know just the right kind of detail, they know just the right kind of inflection, what to focus on, and any kind of storytelling in any medium is the same way. It's about the manner in which it's done. So in comic storytelling, it is the writing and the art put together that's the story. So I wouldn't say it doesn't have a good story. I would say that half of the story is really impressive. The other half of the story, which is the writing, is where this comic has often lost me, especially when it gets to the more abstract, mind-blowing, quote-unquote, parts of it. And that's where certain inconsistencies in tone, like John DeFool's tantrums, start making sense as a sort of connective tissue as the story gets more out there or less practical or less physical in certain ways. This story deals with theology and tarot cards and probably a million other things that I'm not aware of. And I'm not really interested in doing background research in order to understand the story. I'm sure that it amplifies things, but the story should be able to stand on its own. And again, I think that much of the story does stand on its own, and reading it in this format definitely helps, where you're able to allow the art to wash over you more easily. Even if you find some text to be tedious, you're able to scan over it fast and get the meat of the matter and actually interact with the story the way I think it's meant to be. Because I think this comic works best with the reader as part of the writing team. While it is said that this is a book of ideas and a lot of these are just brilliant and crazy ideas that Jodorowsky has that nobody else can have, I think there might almost be too many ideas in here. They're all crowded next to each other and jostling for space, and at times that makes perfect sense because, like the best science fiction, it's like giving you the tip of the iceberg and you extrapolate from there outwards, and other times it's got some mythic narration going on to tell you about the history of certain things, etc. And I truly do appreciate that expansive canvas that has been filled in so meticulously. Where I think the writing falls just short for me is that it chooses the wrong things. It fills in the wrong details and leaves out the wrong ones. Maybe it's just my expectation as a reader trained in reading other kinds of stories. And I know that a lot of people say, oh, it's European and they do stories differently, but I think that's too dismissive. I think there are certain things like arcs and beginning, middle, and end and three-act structure that are a little different from simply classifying things as American comics or Japanese comics or European comics. Not to say that there aren't differences in subject matter and style. Of course, we see a whole bunch of them. Anyway, the point is, I think for me, this book slows down to tell me things when I really want to continue looking at what I'm being shown, and sometimes it just states things and I have a whole bunch of questions that haven't been answered. Of course, this is part of this book's power. I think readers reading this can put a lot of their own interpretations and own thoughts and own imaginations into the story, filling out things that are left out, but really attaching themselves to the text that is there almost religiously. And I think out of my new read of this story, I didn't quite change my mind about this not being one of the greatest comics of all time, but I did find a new appreciation for this as an interactive piece of fiction. I think this edition is the definitive edition to get. In fact, I read this in bed, sitting upright, and it wasn't that uncomfortable, so I was pleased because the bulk makes it look like something you wouldn't be able to do that with. And the beauty of the art, the readability of the text, and the subtle presentation all make it a wonderful edition to have. Of course, all of this is just one man's opinion. I love this book in certain ways. It's still not able to bridge that gap as far as the writing is concerned, but I'd also love to know what you think. Let me know in the comments below whether you love this, whether you don't, whether you've never read it and are curious about it. And I know there's a whole bunch of other stuff, the meta barons and the techno priests. Let me know which of them are the best ones to read. I've heard the follow-up books for this are sort of interesting. The very next one is apparently less spiritual and less abstract and much more a straight-up detective story. Is that something that you think I'll be more likely to enjoy? I invite all expertise and commentary below. Thank you as always for watching. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video.